Joining us now, back in Kabul, is CNN chief international correspondent Clarissa Ward. Clarissa, it is so good to see you in Kabul. Tell us what things are like almost a year later.
Well, Brianna, it's really good to be back here. I think you can probably see behind me, we're at a market. There is a sense of normalcy on the streets of the city. There is not the same sort of or anything approaching the levels of chaos and violence that we saw playing out during those heart-wrenching scenes last year. But the change has also brought about a real decrease in the standard of living here. And a lot of people are now fighting to put food on the table. The UN says that nearly half the country is in a state of acute hunger. The International Rescue Committee says by the second half of this year, they believe, well, we are now in that second half of this year, more than 90% of people will be living below the poverty line. And that's for a whole plethora of reasons, partly because of sanctions and the freezing of Afghanistan's federal reserves after the Taliban took power, partly because of the food crisis, partly because of inflation. But what you see when you go around, and I just want to show you a little bit, seeing as we're here in this market, you can see there is food. There is food that you can buy. The market stalls are full. But the conversations that we've been having with vendors make it clear that for the vast majority of people, it's become unaffordable, this food. So flour, I was told by these vendors, has doubled in price. Cooking oil, which is obviously one of the basic necessities, has more than doubled in price. And that's not even before, Brianna, you start talking about the very real changes and the impact that they've had as the Taliban has gradually become firmer in implementing its vision or version of Sharia law, Brianna.
Clarissa, I'm just struck by how different it looks from 1 year ago. How different, frankly, you look from 1 year ago, dressed a little bit differently than the day after the Taliban regained power. The streets are bustling with men and women behind you, and I absolutely understand the economic challenges they're facing. Also, I don't see any huge armed presence around you like there almost certainly was 1 year ago. Talk to us more about all that.
Yeah, so the Taliban is really trying to have a lighter footprint, at least visibly on the streets. You do still see them. They don't want to be filmed anymore. It's not like the initial days where there was this sense of jubilation and victory. Now you have to get a lot of permission. It's an onerous task to go through the process to be able to report here. And there has been certainly a sort of strangling of the local media. You do see women, as you can see, on the streets. You also see that I am dressed in a less conservative fashion than I was before. I want to stress the Taliban has passed a ruling that women are supposed to wear not just a full hijab, a full head covering, but actually the niqab, which completely covers the face. Many women here wear the burqa. What's interesting to see, though, is that a lot of women in Kabul are like, thanks but no thanks, essentially. They're refusing to wear it. They're continuing to dress how they used to dress. And it seems that for the moment, the Taliban doesn't really have a vested interest in trying to crack down on that and in trying to resurrect the most vaunted, notorious vice and virtue police as they became known. And so there is that sense that perhaps there's a slightly lighter touch than there had been certainly in the 1990s. But I want to stress, John and Brianna, that beneath the surface, we do not see any real meaningful changes in the Taliban's ideology or in its ideas of how best to govern. So when we talk about seeing women on the streets, where we're not seeing women anymore is in their places of previous employment. Women are still allowed to work in the healthcare sector. It's a necessity, and in some humanitarian roles as well as teachers, education. But women who were working in business, women who were working as ministers and in ministries have also been told, in addition to all girls above the age of 12, that instead of going to school and instead of going to work, they must now stay home. The Taliban says that this is just until the right or correct Islamic environment can be created. But this is now many, many months that we have been hearing this, and they have been pressed over and over again, not just by Western journalists, but by Islamic scholars from all over the world and by Muslim countries. as to what the holdup is and what needs to be done. What are these specific conditions that need to be reached in order for girls to return to school, in order for women to be embraced in the workplace again and again? And what we're hearing from the Taliban is kind of obfuscation on this point. They don't want to be drawn into the details as to the conditions themselves, which makes many people here very nervous that there is no real plan, in fact, to try to reintegrate women into this society. John, Brianna?
Yeah, and what does that mean for the future of girls there? There's actually a little girl, Clarissa, who has been darting in and out at times through the back of your live shot there, who we can see, who looks probably, I'd say, she was there before, but she's probably, I'd say, around 10 or south of 10. How in the last year has her future changed? And if you could speak to that for Kabul, but also in rural areas as well.
So this is a really important point that you bring up, Brianna, because what you see and feel in Kabul is not the same as what you're seeing and feeling in rural areas, where women's education was never a priority, where girls were often married off at a very young age, and where the society is, generally speaking, much more conservative and much more supportive of the Taliban. And so what you hear in rural areas is that people are just delighted that the Americans left, that the war has essentially calmed down, that there's been a return to relative peace and quiet, and they're not focused on these sort of more interesting or more compelling to certainly an international audience social issues such as women's rights. But for that 10-year-old girl who you mentioned, her future looks grim. Let's be very clear about this. There is no immediate plan for her to be able to go to school after 6th grade. We hear anecdotally stories of girls deliberately trying to fail their 5th grade classes so that they can be allowed to repeat the year. We know of many cases of girls and women who are coming together to set up underground schools where girls can go and learn in a sort of clandestine environment. But I think that the heartbreak for so many here is that for the 20 years that the U.S. and its allies had a presence in Afghanistan, while that certainly was a very polarized presence and would be categorized as an occupation by many, there was still a chance for women and girls that you could dare to dream, that you could participate in society. Those dreams really have been all but snuffed out now. The IRC, the International Rescue Committee, which I mentioned before, has said that 70% of women's civil society organizations have been forced to shut down, and countless women and girls who were involved in activism, who were trying to speak out on behalf of girls, have either been forced to leave the country or forced to abandon that type of activity because it can potentially be dangerous for them and for their families.
Of course, a couple things that sort of related here. I'm curious if and why the Taliban wants you there. What do they want to show the world today, 1 year later? And just 1 year later, you know, the airport. You spent so much time at the airport 1 year ago as thousands and thousands of people trying to get out. Is that back up, operational and open?
The airport is operational again. We flew a commercial airline in. It's a pretty normal process. You go through passport control, you go through customs, you collect your baggage, you leave the airport. Some of the walls that were daubed with basically slogans about democracy and freedom during the time before the Taliban took power have now been replaced with Islamic slogans and symbols. But also we saw outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs yesterday an interesting one, which says, you know, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan wants peaceful and prosperous relations with the world. So far, Afghanistan, under the Taliban's leadership, is not recognized by a single country. And while the Taliban does seem to understand that that presents real challenges for them and real problems for them, particularly in terms of securing the funding and the investment and the help with development that they so desperately need, they are not yet willing to basically adapt the more pragmatic stances that they had always promised to their people and to the international community. And so they remain rigid on these areas like female education, despite not even trying to claim that there is anything in Islam that prevents women and girls from achieving education. they are still very unflexible in terms of trying to adapt that more conciliatory, pragmatic approach that I just referred to. I think they want to show journalists here two things, and they're pretty categorical about what they don't want you to see. They want to show that life goes on, that there is law and order, that it is relatively safe, and they also want to show that the poverty that is being experienced by people here is biting and it is real, and they want to maximize the amount of pressure that's put particularly on the U.S. to unfreeze those federal reserves and allow free and unfettered humanitarian aid to roll in. Obviously, many things, though, have made that a much more complex prospect than perhaps initially anticipated.